The ball is still loose as they get it to Rodgers. They give it back now to the 30. They're down to the 20. Oh, the band is out on the field. He's going to go into the end zone. He's going into the end zone. Will it count? The Bears have won.
The college football gridiron was a killing field. 1905 was the deadliest season of them all. In 1905, 3 college players and 15 high school players died playing football. 18 young men killed playing football in 1 year. Imagine if that happened, today. Well, in response to this, colleges cut their football programs. Columbia University, they abolished football. They canceled football at Harvard. Out west, Cal and Stanford, they got rid of their football teams. And when this happened, the president of the United States stepped in and he demanded that colleges reform the game in order to save the game. The president in 1905 was Teddy Roosevelt, a man who loved vigorous, strenuous sports. And actually, Roosevelt is one of, I think, 5 presidents I have in today's lecture. Roosevelt had been a boxer while at Harvard. And now as president, he firmly believed that sports like boxing and football bred powerful men, the type of young men who would one day rule the nation, men like him. And so in order to save football, and really in order to save this nation, Roosevelt summoned representatives from Harvard, Yale, and Princeton to the White House for an emergency meeting. And he told them something had to be done in order to make the game safer. The game had to be made safer in order to keep it in existence. And so out of all of the bloodshed in 1905, we get another series of rule changes that make the game somewhat safer, but certainly make the game a lot more like the game of football that we know today. Here are the rules. The new rules made it illegal to lock arms and propel teammates through the opposition. And you could block for your teammates, but forming a human chain, that was now abolished. These new rules demanded that at least 7 players stand directly on the line of scrimmage, so no more mass running starts, no more high-velocity flying V. To encourage more deception and less brutal force, they lengthened the demands for a first down from 5 yards to 10 yards. And maybe most significantly, in order to spread out the field and encourage more deception, the forward pass was legalized. It's that last rule, the legalization of the forward pass. It changes everything. The forward pass has dramatically changed the game of football. Thinking about it big term, along with the automobile, the television, and the birth control pill, I rank it as one of the 4 most significant inventions of the 20th century. Although I'm thinking about it, maybe not the forward pass, but I'm saying it was big. All of these things changed lives. And so here's our moment. In 1906, 62 colleges and universities, they signed on to these new rules. They became the inaugural members of something called the Intercollegiate Athletic Association of the United States. 4 years later, in 1910, that organization is going to change its name to the National Collegiate Athletic Association, the NCAA. That's where the NCAA comes from. The NCAA was created to save college football by making college football less deadly. It's tempting to ask, do we love football because it mimics American imperial and military power? Because think about it. What is the goal of football? You defend your turf, and your ultimate goal is to penetrate deep into enemy territory. And that's the goal of the imperialist project as well. And think of all of the ways that football borrows from the culture of American militarism. First of all, there's this. The flying wedge that I just told you about, it has its origins in military maneuvers. The early language of football, it drew on military experience. There were drills, training camps, strategy, tactics. Since World War II, we have taken this even further. Quarterbacks throw the bomb, defenses counter with the blitz, which comes from the Nazi blitzkrieg in World War II. Linemen do battle in the trenches. I think it's for all of these reasons, all of these links between football and militarism, that maybe no school got more meaning out of the game than the United States Military Academy, right? Home of the Army Cadets. They started playing football up at West Point in 1890. And the storied Army football program is going to eventually send 4 coaches to the Hall of Fame. 3 Army players are going to win the Heisman Trophy. At Army, they thought of football as a training ground. I mean, sure, you could go in a classroom and you can learn about military tactics and philosophy, but the football field was where young men about to go off to war, where they could prove their toughness and their bravery to themselves and to their fellow players, prove their toughness and their bravery to themselves and their fellow soldiers. At the start of the 20th century, all the way through the 1950s at least, Americans celebrated the Army football program because this team was said to represent our nation. You know, those are our boys. And this is what made what happened on November 9th, 1912, so symbolic. On this day, the Army cadets got trounced on the football field by a bunch of young men from the Carlisle Indian School. And this is the second of the moments I want to emphasize. The Carlisle Indian School was a boarding school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania for American Indians. Carlisle was a school run by white philanthropists. It was a place where Indian children were taught the ways of white culture. The idea here at Carlisle was that the quote unquote wild Indian would be stripped of his heritage and would become civilized. The, I suppose, well-meaning but very problematic motto of the Carlisle Indian School was save the man and kill the Indian. In order to do this, the Indian would be taught English and mathematics. He would be taught proper table manners, and he would be taught sports like football, sports like baseball. You know, if you want to turn a so-called wild Indian into a so-called real American, I realize that's an ironic statement, teach him to play football and baseball. The Carlisle School's football team was led by an innovative and always tinkering coach named Glenn Pop Warner. And Warner's best player was a young man from the Sac and Fox tribes in Oklahoma, Jim Thorpe. Jim Thorpe is arguably the greatest all-around athlete in American history. Thorpe excelled at every sport that he played at Carlisle. He was a great baseball player. He was an outstanding lacrosse player. He was the star of the school's track team. He was an All-American in football. I mean, for crying out loud, Jim Thorpe was a collegiate national champion in ballroom dancing. Jim Thorpe very famously represented the United States at the 1912 Summer Olympic Games in Stockholm, Sweden. There he won gold medals in both the decathlon and the pentathlon. Here he is receiving his medals from the Swedish King Gustav. When King Gustav awarded Jim Thorpe his medals, he said, "Sir, you are the greatest athlete in the world." To which Jim Thorpe replied, "Thanks, King." These medals were later taken away from Jim Thorpe. I'd be happy to discuss this in the Q&A later, but I want to get to this moment. A few months after his Olympic victories, Thorpe returned to Carlisle, and he was the best player on the Carlisle Indian team. And then in November, this Carlisle team, they traveled to West Point to play Army. I'm not sure there has ever been a more symbolic contest in the history of American sports. Sure, there was Joe Louis against Max Schmeling, an American against a Nazi in 1938. There was Billie Jean King's tennis victory over Bobby Riggs in 1973. And there was the Miracle on Ice, right? The gutty Americans against the powerful Soviets in Lake Placid in 1980. All meaningful and all symbolic. But think of the symbolism right here. Just 22 years earlier, American soldiers in the American Army, they had routed, or what we might and probably should say, massacred American Indians at Wounded Knee. This moment is kind of thought of as Native America's last gasp. And now here we are in 1912. And it's the sons of those massacred at Wounded Knee against the sons of the soldiers who had done the killing. And I mean that metaphorically, not literally. But now they would face each other on a different field of battle at West Point. And the 1912 Army team was a significant squad in the history of Army football. On that team, for example, there was an overachieving, hard-hitting linebacker named Dwight David Eisenhower. That's him, third from the left, our future president, president number 2 in our lecture today. There was the future general and chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Omar Bradley. That's him, second on the right. Eisenhower later said that his goal in this game was to knock Jim Thorpe senseless with one powerful hit. And that was the general tactic in early college football. The opposing team's best player was relentlessly targeted with the goal of knocking him out of the contest. Eisenhower got his chance in the second quarter, and he hit Thorpe with all his might. But Thorpe remained in the game, and Jim Thorpe ran all over Army. Jim Thorpe accounted for 2 touchdowns and kicked 3 field goals, and Carlisle cruised to a 27-6 victory. It's one of the worst Army defeats of that era. I think rarely have sports provided such an opportunity for symbolic revenge. And I'm choosing that phrase, symbolic revenge, quite purposefully. And that's because you can't really say that Carlisle's victory over Army, that it upset the social order. I mean, Jim Thorpe is going to go on to have a troubled career and a troubled rest of his life. Eisenhower and Bradley are obviously going to go on to have remarkable public careers. The 1969 season marked the centennial of college football, the matchup between undefeated Arkansas and undefeated Texas, what is often called the game of the century. These were 2 of the Southern powers, Texas and Arkansas. Their game often decided who won the Southwest Conference and who went to the Cotton Bowl. And in 1969, these 2 programs, they were directed by legendary coaches. There was Frank Broyles of Arkansas and Darrell Royal of Texas. And then when they met in this last game, neither team had yet lost. There are many sports writers who predicted that the winner of this game would go on to be the national champion. One of the many things that makes this game so notable is that both of these football teams in 1969, they were both still all white. There were no black players. And in retrospect, kind of taking a wide-angle view, this is the last major American sporting event played between 2 all-white teams. And I'll say that again, because I think this is important. This is the last major American sporting event played between 2 all-white teams. By 1969, professional baseball and basketball and football, they were all desegregated. College basketball, that sport was desegregating rapidly. But college football in the South was hanging on. It was still a segregated sport down in the major Southern conferences. All of the players, all of the coaches, pretty much all of the fans were white. It is for this reason that this 1969 Texas-Arkansas game is also called Dixie's Last Stand. So an all-white University of Texas team versus an all-white University of Arkansas team in Dixie's Last Stand. This game marks the end of an era, the era of segregation in college sports. Giving this game even a little bit more juice was the fact that the president of the United States, Richard Nixon, he was there. He was in attendance, so president number 3. Nixon was a lot like Teddy Roosevelt. He had a close relationship to football. He had played football himself at Whittier College, or he was on the team at least. He actually didn't play all that much. But Richard Nixon believed in football. He thought that what America needed more of were those types of young men with crew cuts on Texas and Arkansas who said, yes, sir, when told to do something by a figure of authority, be it their coach, their drill sergeant, or their president. Nixon thought what America needed less of were those long-haired anti-war protesters who were burning their draft cards, marching against the Vietnam War, and making his presidency a general pain in the ass. So Richard Nixon loved football. He loved football culture. But there was a political reason for him to attend this 1969 game as well. Richard Nixon was trying very hard to appeal to white voters in the South. So going to this game was a form of politicking. Going to this game was a form of appealing to white Southern voters. Nixon had been challenged down in the South in 1968 by an arch segregationist named George Wallace. And so going to this game was seen as a way of shoring up his conservative credentials. As the rest of the nation was becoming more defiant of authority and more racially integrated, Southern college football fields, they were like spaces stuck in time. They were places untouched by those trends. And so Nixon wanted to be there. Game day was quite a scene. The famed evangelist Billy Graham, he gave the pregame prayer. Then the crowd roared when Richard Nixon entered the stadium and he took his seat among the throngs. He was there with several members of his staff, as well as with the Arkansas Senator William Fulbright. That's Fulbright just to the right of the president. Not to mention a U.S. representative from Texas, the future president, George H.W. Bush. That's him 3 people to Nixon's left, staring right at the camera. At the end of the field, anti-war protesters seized on Nixon's attendants and they unfurled this giant peace emblem, and they held up signs of anger about the My Lai massacre, which Americans were just learning about, the Vietnam massacre. An urban legend later grew up around this moment. It was later said that one of the protesters here was an Arkansas native and the future president, Bill Clinton. Wouldn't that have been something if 3 U.S. presidents had all been there for this game? Unfortunately, it's not true. The facts are simple. Bill Clinton was not there. He had a Rhodes Scholarship and he was at Oxford in England in 1969, though he was listening to the game on a shortwave radio with some American friends. I mean, after all, it was the game of the century. And it was a great game. Arkansas took a 14-0 lead and they held it into the 4th quarter, but then Texas stormed back and scored 15 unanswered points. It was Texas 15-14. And then Nixon did something interesting. He took matters into his own hands and he presented the Texas coach, Darrell Royal, with a plaque, a presidential plaque announcing Texas as the national champion in 1969. This despite the fact that there were still bowl games to be played, and this was despite the fact that Penn State College was still undefeated as well. Actually, both Texas and Penn State are going to finish the 1969 season undefeated, and that, I suppose, is another of the great significance of this game. Both teams claim to be the best. It was never settled on the field. And so this argument between Texas and Penn State, it was one of the major arguments in favor of what eventually became, 4.5 decades later, the college football playoff. The Texas-Penn State debate and Nixon's involvement in it also led to a great quote from Penn State coach Joe Paterno. Paterno was a conservative Republican. I think all football coaches were back then. He was a backer of Nixon. But during a Penn State commencement speech that he gave in 1973, he said, "I've wondered how Richard Nixon could know so little about Watergate in 1973 and so much about football in 1969.